The scorching summer sun hung thick in the air, making the pavement shimmer like a mirage. The heat had driven most of the neighbors indoors, seeking refuge in the cool shade of their homes. But on a quiet street in Santa Clarita, California, life moved at a slow and steady pace. Lawns were neatly trimmed, sprinklers clicked in rhythmic bursts, and the smell of freshly cut grass blended with the smoky aroma of barbecue drifting from a few houses down. For most, it was just another hot day. But for 7-year-old Emma, this day meant everything. She sat on a small wooden stool, her feet barely skimming the ground, as she arranged her lemonade stand with great care. It was a simple setup, a folding table draped with a faded checkered cloth, a pitcher of ice-cold lemonade beading with condensation, and a small stack of plastic cups neatly lined up on one side. But the real centerpiece was the sign, handwritten in big, bold, uneven letters, "Lemonade for Hope." Emma's determination was clear in every little movement, from the way she adjusted the sign to make sure passing cars could see it, to the bright, hopeful smile she offered each person who walked by. But unlike most kids running lemonade stands to buy a new toy or save up for a trip to the amusement park, Emma had a much more urgent reason. She was raising money for her own chemotherapy treatments. No child should ever have to make a choice like that, but Emma had faced more hardship in her 7 years than many endure in a lifetime. Nearly a year ago, she had been diagnosed with leukemia. Since then, her world had become a blur of hospital rooms, needles, and treatments that left her exhausted and sick. But she refused to let it take away her spirit. From the porch, her mother, Claire, watched with an aching heart. Pride and sorrow twisted together as she took in the sight of her little girl, waving eagerly at passing cars. Emma's once long, golden hair was now cropped short, a quiet reminder of everything she had been through. Yet there she was, smiling, her deep brown eyes shining with determination. A jogger passed, offering a curious glance before continuing on. A car slowed for a moment, then drove off. But Emma never let it bother her. She simply straightened her sign, poured herself a small cup of lemonade, and waited. Her first customer of the day was Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman from down the street, who shuffled up to the stand with her cane. "How much for a cup, sweetheart?" she asked, her voice warm and kind. $1, Emma answered with a grin. Mrs. Henderson pulled out a $10 bill and pressed it into Emma's hand. "Keep the change," she said softly, her gaze lingering on the words "Lemonade for Hope" written across the sign. She gave Emma's hand a gentle pat before making her way back home. Little by little, more neighbors stopped by. Some bought lemonade, others simply dropped a few bills or coins into the mason jar labeled donations. Each person who stopped left behind words of encouragement, small moments of kindness that made the scorching day a little brighter. But as the afternoon stretched on, it became clear that Emma was still far from reaching her goal. She did not let it discourage her. What she did not know, what no one could have predicted, was that this would be the day everything changed. That someone extraordinary was about to step into her life and turn her little lemonade stand into something far greater than she had ever imagined. Emma's journey had begun in the most unexpected way. She had always been full of life, the kind of child who ran barefoot through the grass, climbed trees without fear, and zoomed around the neighborhood on her pink bicycle, tassels fluttering in the wind. She had a wild imagination, filling page after page with colorful drawings of animals, castles, and faraway lands. Then, one day, everything changed. It started subtly, getting tired more easily, struggling to finish bike rides, taking more naps after school. Small bruises appeared on her arms and legs, ones that her parents brushed off at first. "She is just growing," her father, Brian, had said. But Claire could not shake the gnawing worry growing inside her. Then came the fever. It started low but kept climbing, refusing to go away. Emma's appetite faded, and soon, she was losing weight at an alarming rate. One afternoon, Claire watched as Emma tried to lift her paintbrush, something she had done 100 times before, only to see her tiny hands tremble with effort. That was the moment Claire knew something was terribly wrong. Claire and Brian rushed Emma to the pediatrician, hoping for reassurance but fearing the worst. The waiting room smelled faintly of antiseptic, its walls covered in cheerful posters meant to comfort anxious families. But nothing could ease Claire's nerves as they waited for answers. The tests were endless: blood draws, scans, questions from doctors. The minutes stretched into hours, and then, finally, the doctor walked in. His expression said it all before he even spoke. "Emma has leukemia," he said gently, as if speaking softly could somehow make the words hurt less. The room spun. Claire reached for Brian's hand, her fingers clutching his like a lifeline, as the weight of those words crashed over them. Claire's mind swirled with an endless stream of worries. What did this diagnosis really mean for Emma? How bad was it? Could they even afford the treatments? The fear gripped her so tightly she could barely breathe. Emma, on the other hand, did not fully understand what was happening at first. But she could sense the shift in her parents, the way their voices softened when they spoke to her, the way her mother held her just a little longer at bedtime, the way her father's forehead creased with worry even when he tried to smile. They explained it to her in the simplest way they could, assuring her that they would do whatever it took to make her better. As the weeks stretched into months, the reality of it all sank in. The hospital became her second home. The doctors and nurses turned into familiar faces. The sharp scent of antiseptic, the beeping of monitors, the dull ache in her arms from IVs, it all became part of her world. Chemotherapy took its toll, stripping her of energy, appetite, and the golden locks she had once twirled absent-mindedly between her fingers. But no matter how sick she felt, Claire never left her side. She held Emma's hand through the worst of it, whispering soothing words when the pain became unbearable. Brian worked harder than ever, picking up extra shifts, trying desperately to keep up with the mounting medical bills. The weight of it all showed in the tired lines on his face, but he never let Emma see his exhaustion. And yet, through all of it, Emma never lost the light inside her. She found happiness in the smallest things: a nurse who told goofy jokes, a coloring book gifted by a kind stranger, the soft comfort of her favorite blanket. One evening, as she sat on the living room floor, cross-legged, coloring with quiet focus, her parents whispered in the kitchen, their voices low with worry. Without looking up, Emma spoke. "What if I did something to help?" Claire stepped closer, kneeling beside her daughter and brushing away a few wisps of what little hair remained on her forehead. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Emma set her crayon down and met her mother's gaze, her brown eyes filled with something rare: hope. "What if I sold lemonade?" she said, her voice carrying a quiet certainty. "People like lemonade. Maybe they would buy some to help me." Claire felt her throat tighten. The innocence of it, the sheer beauty of the idea, broke her heart and filled it at the same time. She wrapped Emma in a hug, her voice trembling. "That is a wonderful idea, honey. We will make it happen." And so, the very next day, they got to work. Emma took her time designing the sign, carefully choosing bright colors and bold letters. She put all her energy into it, even when her hands felt weak, even when the fatigue threatened to pull her under. Meanwhile, Claire gathered the supplies: lemons, sugar, cups, and an old folding table buried in the garage. By the time Saturday morning arrived, everything was ready. The sun climbed early, casting golden light across the quiet neighborhood. Emma, dressed in her favorite yellow sundress, the one she insisted matched the lemonade, adjusted the floppy straw hat shading her face. Though the treatments had left her looking pale and fragile, excitement painted her cheeks with a soft pink glow. Claire helped her carry out the table, covering it with a checkered cloth they had found in storage. The pitcher of lemonade, freshly made that morning, stood proudly in the center, its surface already glistening with condensation. A neat stack of plastic cups sat beside it, along with a mason jar labeled donations, the words written in Emma's own wobbly but determined handwriting. The sign was her masterpiece. She had spent days working on it, making sure each letter stood out: lemonade for hope. Beneath the words, she had drawn a bright yellow sun and a red heart, imperfect but full of love. Claire propped it up on an old easel, making sure it was visible to anyone passing by. The first hour was slow. A jogger passed, giving Emma a friendly wave but not stopping. A car slowed down, the driver glancing curiously at the stand, but then drove off. Emma did not let it bother her. She adjusted her hat, poured herself a tiny cup of lemonade, and took a careful sip, waiting patiently. Then, just before mid-morning, her first customer arrived. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman from 2 houses down, shuffled toward the stand, her cane tapping softly against the pavement. "Good morning, Emma," she greeted, her voice gentle and warm. Emma's face lit up. "Good morning, Mrs. Henderson. Would you like some lemonade? It is $1 a cup." Mrs. Henderson smiled and reached into her purse, pulling out a $10 bill. "I would love some, sweetheart. Keep the change, okay?" Emma's hands trembled slightly as she handed over a cup. "Thank you so much," she said, the gratitude in her voice raw and real. As Mrs. Henderson walked away, more neighbors began to arrive. A young mother pushing a stroller stopped to buy a cup, offering Emma an encouraging smile. Then came a group of kids from her school, dragging their parents along. They filled the stand with their laughter, their voices buzzing with excitement as they bought lemonade and asked about her sign. The stand had only just begun, but something special was already happening. What had started as a little girl's dream to help herself was about to become something much bigger than she had ever imagined. "It's Clint Eastwood." The words rippled through the gathering like a sudden gust of wind. Heads turned. Eyes widened. A hushed excitement swept over the small crowd as they began to recognize the man standing before them. Emma blinked up at him, completely unaware of the weight his name carried. To her, he was just a kind stranger who had stopped for lemonade. Claire, on the other hand, felt her breath catch in her throat. She had watched his movies for years, had seen his face on countless screens. And now, here he was, standing in their driveway, handing her daughter a check that could change everything. The crowd began to murmur louder, some pulling out their phones, whispering to one another in disbelief. But Clint Eastwood remained as composed as ever, his expression steady, his eyes locked onto Emma's. $50,000. Emma whispered again, still trying to process the number in her hands. Clint gave her a small nod. "I figure that ought to keep your lemonade business going for a while." Emma's face split into the widest grin yet. Without hesitation, she threw her arms around him in a hug. The crowd gasped, watching as the legendary actor, known for his tough, no-nonsense roles, smiled down at the tiny girl clinging to him. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice muffled against his jacket. Clint gave her a gentle pat on the back. "No, thank you, kid. For reminding us what real courage looks like." Claire wiped at her eyes, overwhelmed by the kindness, the generosity, the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. This wasn't just about the money, though it would certainly ease their burdens, it was about the hope it represented. The crowd began to applaud, the once quiet street now filled with cheers and shouts of admiration. More people stepped forward, some tossing bills into the donation jar, others just wanting to shake Emma's hand. The lemonade stand, once a small dream of a brave little girl, had suddenly become something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. As Clint Eastwood stood up, he placed a firm hand on Claire's shoulder. "You've got one hell of a kid here," he said softly. Claire let out a shaky breath. "I know," she replied, her voice thick with emotion. With a final nod, Clint tipped an imaginary hat toward Emma and turned to leave. The crowd parted as he walked back down the street, the murmurs following him like an echo. Emma looked down at the check again, then up at her mother. "Mom," she said, her voice filled with something new, something stronger than before. Claire crouched beside her. "Yes, sweetheart. We're going to help other kids too, right?" Claire felt her heart swell, a fresh wave of tears threatening to fall. She nodded, brushing a hand gently over Emma's cheek. Yes, baby. We are. And just like that, Lemonade for Hope was no longer just about Emma. It was about something much bigger, something that would go on to touch more lives than they ever could have imagined. Wait a minute, is that Clint Eastwood? The name rippled through the small crowd like a wildfire catching dry leaves. Conversations halted, heads turned, and within seconds, phones emerged from pockets. Whispers turned to murmurs, then gasps, and soon everyone was craning their necks, trying to get a better look at the legendary figure standing at Emma's lemonade stand. Emma, however, remained blissfully unaware of the weight his name carried. She studied him, tilting her head with innocent curiosity. "Are you famous or something?" she asked, squinting up at him. Clint chuckled, crouching slightly so he could meet her eyes. "A little bit," he admitted, his tone light. Then, with a small smirk, he added, "But not as famous as you're going to be, Emma." A soft wave of laughter rippled through the crowd, easing the tension of the moment and replacing it with warmth. Clint reached out and gently patted Emma's shoulder. "You keep doing what you're doing, kiddo," he said. "The world could use more people like you." The donation jar was already overflowing, the check had been written, yet it was clear that this moment was far from over. What Clint had done was just the spark, what followed would be a wildfire of kindness. The energy in the air shifted as the realization sank in. The legendary Clint Eastwood had not only stopped at a little girl's lemonade stand, but he had donated $50,000 without hesitation. The crowd, which had already been growing, now pulsed with excitement. More whispers, more photos, more stunned expressions. And yet, Clint remained unfazed, his focus locked on Emma and her family. Emma's small hands trembled as she stared down at the check, the bold numbers nearly too much for her to comprehend. $50,000, she whispered. Claire crouched beside her daughter, her own hands shaking as she gently took the check to confirm what her eyes were already telling her. Her breath hitched, and before she could stop them, tears slipped down her face. This is incredible," she choked out. I can't believe this." Clint smiled, the deep lines on his weathered face softening with quiet kindness. "It's not about the money," he said, his voice steady. "It's about showing this little warrior that she's not alone. She's already done the hard part. She just needed a little push." The crowd erupted into applause. Inspired by what they had just witnessed, neighbors who had come for a simple cup of lemonade stepped forward, eager to contribute. Mr. Alvarez, the ever-cheerful mailman, was the first to break the silence. He pulled a $50 bill from his wallet and held it up. "Emma," he said, grinning. "I think Clint's got the right idea. Let's make sure you get everything you need." That was all it took. One by one, people reached into their pockets and purses, pulling out whatever they could spare. Some handed over crisp $20 bills, others added crumpled 5s and 1s to the already overflowing jar. A few even pulled out checkbooks, scribbling down donations on the spot. The one small lemonade stand had transformed into something much bigger, a movement of kindness, generosity, and hope. Claire wiped at her tear-streaked face, overwhelmed as she tried to keep up with the wave of people stepping forward, offering not just money but hugs, words of encouragement, and support in any way they could. Emma, still standing behind her lemonade table, took it all in with wide eyes, her face glowing with gratitude. After a moment, she giggled. "Does this mean I don't have to sell lemonade anymore?" she asked, looking up at Clint with a shy smile. Clint let out a deep chuckle, his laughter rolling over the crowd like a warm breeze. "You don't have to, kid," he said, crouching once again to meet her gaze. "But something tells me you're going to keep finding ways to make the world a little brighter. It's just who you are." The crowd murmured in agreement, the admiration for this little girl clear in their eyes. Then, from somewhere in the back, someone called out, "Group photo." Within minutes, neighbors huddled together, smiling broadly as they posed with Emma and Clint at the center. The moment was captured by a local photographer, and that single photograph, Emma in her yellow sundress, clutching a check almost as big as she was, standing beside Clint Eastwood, would later go viral, becoming a symbol of the power of one small act of kindness. By the end of the day, the total cash donations had surpassed $10,000, and that was not including Clint's check. A lemonade stand that had begun as a desperate attempt to help pay for a child's medical bills had turned into something far greater, a beacon of generosity, proof that compassion still thrived in the world. But Clint was not done yet. As the crowd began to thin, he leaned in close to Claire and spoke just above a whisper. "I've got some friends who'd like to help out too," he said. "Don't be surprised if you hear from them in the next few days." Claire, still overwhelmed by everything that had happened, could only nod. Her voice wavered as she finally managed to say, "Thank you. You've changed our lives." Clint gave her a small nod, then stood, addressing the remaining crowd. "You've got a special little girl here," he said. "Take care of her, and keep taking care of each other." With that, he tipped an imaginary hat to Emma, turned, and walked away, his silhouette disappearing down the sunlit street. And just like that, Emma's story was no longer just her own. It belonged to the whole world. As Clint Eastwood's leather jacket caught the golden glow of the late afternoon sun, the neighborhood watched in silence as he disappeared down the street. The weight of what had just happened settled over them, a mix of awe, gratitude, and something even deeper, hope. But the story was far from over. Clint's generosity had set off a chain reaction, and in the days that followed, Emma's lemonade stand became more than just a small neighborhood fundraiser. It became a nationwide movement. The photos and videos taken by neighbors spread quickly across social media, shared thousands of times in a matter of hours. News outlets picked up the story, and soon, headlines everywhere were talking about the brave little girl selling lemonade for her chemotherapy and the Hollywood legend who had stopped by to help. The image of Emma, standing proudly in front of her stand with her bright, hand-drawn sign and radiant smile, melted hearts across the country. At first, Claire and Brian were overwhelmed by the sudden attention. Strangers began showing up at their door, bringing donations, flowers, and heartfelt cards for Emma. The family's mailbox overflowed with envelopes, many containing checks, some large, some small, but all filled with love. One particular letter, handwritten in wobbly print, came from a little boy in Kansas. It read, "Dear Emma, I saw your story and wanted to help. I don't have a lot of money, but I hope this $2 makes a difference. You're so brave. Love, Charlie, age 8. Emma's eyes welled with tears as she carefully placed the letter in a shoebox she had started filling with all the cards and notes she received. "These people are helping me," she said softly one evening, as she stacked the letters neatly inside the box. "I want to remember them." But the story did not just inspire individuals, it caught the attention of businesses, charities, and even hospitals. A nearby hospital reached out, offering to cover any remaining medical costs Emma's family might face. A popular lemonade brand sent her a year's supply of their product, along with a heartfelt message. "Emma, your bravery reminds us of the sweetness of life. Keep inspiring the world." Claire and Brian could hardly believe it. The financial weight that had once loomed over their family like a storm cloud was slowly lifting, piece by piece, thanks to the kindness of strangers. And it was not just money, people began offering help in ways they never expected. Families volunteered to bring them meals, neighbors offered to drive them to appointments, and local businesses even helped with childcare when Claire and Brian needed time to catch their breath. But the most unexpected impact of Clint's visit was the way Emma's story spread beyond her own community. Inspired by her courage, children all over the country started setting up their own lemonade stands, donating their earnings to local hospitals and cancer charities. A movement began to take shape, and soon the hashtag #HardLemonadeForHope was trending on social media. Stories poured in from across the country, kids raising money for sick friends and family members, communities rallying together, and even celebrities stepping forward to make donations in Emma's name. Through it all, Emma remained humble. One evening, as she sat on the living room floor with her parents, sorting through another stack of letters, she looked up with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think we can help other kids like me?" she asked. "Maybe we can do something bigger." Claire and Brian exchanged a glance, and in that moment, an idea was born. With the extra funds they had raised, they helped Emma launch the Lemonade for Hope Foundation, an initiative dedicated to supporting families struggling with the costs of medical treatments. The foundation's mission was simple: no child should have to choose between fighting for their life and worrying about how to pay for it. The organization started small, but it did not stay that way for long. Within weeks, donations poured in from all over the world. Schools organized lemonade stand fundraisers, businesses pledged matching donations, and entire communities took inspiration from Emma's story, starting their own local efforts to help children in need. Then, one day, a special package arrived at Emma's doorstep. Inside was a framed photo of her and Clint Eastwood, taken that unforgettable day at her lemonade stand. Tucked alongside it was a handwritten note. "Keep fighting, kid. You're making the world a better place." Emma's eyes sparkled as she read the words aloud, her voice steadied despite the emotion welling in her chest. She looked up at her parents, a soft smile playing on her lips. "We're just getting started," she whispered. "I want to make him proud," Emma said softly, clutching the note to her heart. What had started as a simple lemonade stand had grown into something far greater, a movement that proved even the smallest acts of kindness could spark something extraordinary. But for Emma and her family, this journey was not just about the generosity they had received. It was about the new hope they could now give to others. Months after that unforgettable day, life looked different for Emma and her family. The worry that had once etched deep lines into Claire and Brian's faces had softened, replaced by something they had not felt in a long time: relief. The crushing weight of medical bills no longer loomed over them, thanks to the kindness of neighbors, strangers, and one legendary actor who had stepped in when they needed it most. Emma's health was still a work in progress, her treatments ongoing, but with the financial burden lifted, the family could focus on supporting her in every way possible. Without the constant fear of how they would pay for the next round of care, they could finally breathe. Through it all, Emma's spirit remained as bright as ever. The lemonade stand, which had once been a desperate attempt to help, became a cherished memory, not just for their family, but for everyone who had been a part of that extraordinary day. But the story did not end there. Emma's foundation, Lemonade for Hope, grew at an astonishing rate. What began as a simple act of giving back turned into a national movement. Schools across the country joined in, hosting lemonade fundraisers and teaching children about the power of kindness. Companies pledged matching donations. Families who had once struggled under the weight of medical expenses began to receive the support they needed, thanks to Emma's initiative. The little girl who had once sat on a stool in her driveway, pouring lemonade with shaky hands, was now an inspiration to thousands. She became a symbol of resilience and compassion, proof that even the smallest voices could create echoes that reached far and wide. One day, during a local event celebrating the foundation's success, Emma stood on a small stage, clutching a microphone. Her hand still trembled a little, but her confidence shone through. The crowd, neighbors, volunteers, supporters, watched as she took a deep breath. "Hi, everyone," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I just wanted to say thank you. When I started my lemonade stand, I just wanted to help my mom and dad. I did not think so many people would care. But you did. And now we can help other kids like me. So thank you for believing in me." The applause was thunderous. Claire pulled her into a tight hug, whispering, "You have made me so proud." At the back of the crowd, unnoticed by most, stood Clint Eastwood. Dressed casually in a simple jacket and baseball cap, he watched with a small smile, his hands tucked into his pockets. He did not need recognition. He had not come for the cameras or the attention. He was simply there to witness what Emma had done, to see how one small act of kindness had grown into something so much bigger. As the event wrapped up, a reporter approached Emma with one final question. "Emma, through everything you have experienced, what is the biggest lesson you have learned?" She paused, thinking for a moment before answering. "I learned that it does not matter how big or small you are, you can always do something to help," she said. "And when people help each other, amazing things can happen." Her words became the rallying cry of the Lemonade for Hope Foundation, a message that spread far beyond their little town. Stories poured in from all over, kids inspired by Emma's story, starting their own acts of kindness. Some hosted bake sales, others organized car washes, all with the same goal: to make the world a little bit brighter. The family never forgot the moment that changed their lives, the day a man in a leather jacket stopped at their lemonade stand and saw the heart behind a simple sign. And as Emma's story continued to inspire, it served as a reminder that even in the darkest times, kindness and hope could light the way forward. If this story moved you, take a moment to think about how you can make a difference. No act of kindness is too small. Share this story. Inspire someone else. And always remember, every small ripple of kindness can turn into a wave.